Welcome back. What I want to do with this lecture is kind of dig back into an issue that has been with us really since the beginning of class, but we've not really dedicated any entirety to, at least on a direct sort of basis. And of course, what I would be referring to when it comes to that would be the issue of civil rights. As you're going to find out, it's not for no good reason that the civil rights movement, the movement that you think of when I say civil rights movement, it's not going to be for no good reason that it comes in the aftermath of World War II. Um, Part of this is going to be the experience that African Americans and people of color generally are going to have in service to the war. You are going to have black veterans, you're going to have people of Latin American ancestry that will serve, people of Japanese American ancestry will also serve. And this experience in fighting for democracy and fighting to defeat totalitarianism is going to have a really profound impact on people when they come back home to the United States. The other thing that I need you to be aware of is that images like the image that you're looking on right here, if you're following along with me on our PowerPoint, were quite familiar to American people in the aftermath of World War II. The Nazi crimes against humanity, the Japanese that will go on trial for their war crimes in the aftermath of the war. These are all very familiar to Americans, primarily because a lot of these trials are going to be covered publicly on television. And so these are very clear and memorable images to the American people. And this issue of racial violence, you have to understand there are a lot of people that are beginning to come full circle with the hypocrisy that America is preaching. America is the light of the world, and we don't have these sorts of things that happened in Nazi Germany happening here in the United States, except we've got our own brand of racial totalitarianism. Okay? I told you this at the beginning of the semester when we were discussing the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, that Supreme Court decision that essentially legalized discrimination and segregation in our country. That would enter us into arguably the darkest race relations period in American history. Um, we also have talked about people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who was trying to get an anti-lynching bill on the federal books throughout the 1930s. And for all of his political wizardry, Franklin Roosevelt, even at the behest of Eleanor Roosevelt, was never able to get a federal anti-lynching law on the books. And so as you're seeing in this PowerPoint, there are hundreds, thousands even, of African Americans and other people of color that were lynched in the United States on a year-by-year basis. And although the NAACP is trying to draw attention to it, if you're looking at that flag flying there, that's Harlem, there's not a whole lot of federal activism that is getting out in front of this. That is going to change in our class here today, and it's going to change at least a really big part of this through the life and times of a guy from Chicago by the name of Emmett Till. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about the background of Emmett Till because this will be very informative in terms of understanding how his story will influence the rest of the nation. Emmett Till was the only son of a lady from Chicago by the name of Mamie Till. And Mamie Till was a product of the Great Migration. Her family had emigrated from the rural South, from a very small town in Mississippi in the 1920s. And she had met a man in Chicago, settled down, got married, and they had one baby. That was Emmett Till. Emmett was her only child, and she really doted upon him. She babied him, if that makes any sense. Okay. And in 1955, Emmett's about 14 years of age, and he comes to his mother with this revelation that he wants to know more about his own personal ancestry. He wants to take a much more active interest in the family, and he wants to see where she grew up in Mississippi. He's heard all these stories, and he wants to see this with his own eyes. On the one hand, Mamie is thrilled. This is her son, her only son, taking an active interest in the family's history. But at the same time, she's absolutely terrified. You have to understand that she, like any other mother or parent, had shielded her child from the harsher realities of the real world. And the fact was, Emmett grew up in Chicago. And although Chicago was a long, long way from a racial utopia, it was also a long, long way from the rural South. There were things that you did in Chicago that you just kind of took for granted and you didn't really think too much of them, that you would absolutely never, ever even dream of doing if you happened to be a person of color in the rural South. Okay? Ultimately, what Mamie decides that she's going to do is she is going to allow Emmett Till to go down and visit Mississippi, but there would be conditions, one of which was that he would be supervised and chaperoned by his grandfather, a guy by the name of Mose Wright. The other condition, and this is far more telling, it says, under no certain circumstances should you ever, ever look a white woman in the eye. A little bit of foreshadowing there, but for right now, I want to fast forward a couple weeks, August 1955. Emmett Till is hanging outside of this meat market. It's probably what you and I would call a convenience store. And he's hanging out with his cousins and their buddies. And what they're doing is what 14-year-old boys have done best since the beginning of time. They're talking trash. Emmett's teasing them, and he says, you know, all of you people down here in the South, you're a bunch of pushovers. Nobody tells me how I can and can't live up in Chicago. As a matter of fact, I've got me a white girlfriend up in Chicago. And everybody roars with laughter because they know that there's no way that what he's saying he can prove. And so Emmett can't look like a fool in front of his friends. He pulls out of his wallet, produces a picture of a white girl. And once again, everybody roars with laughter because they say, for all we know, that photograph came with the wallet. But listen, if you really want to prove yourself to us, there's a white lady that works the counter inside that store, Bryant's Meat Market. Go in there and ask her out on a date, and then we'll believe you. Now, you have to understand two things. Number one, you have to understand that nobody thought that Emmett Till would be stupid enough to do something like this, right? So nobody really thought much was going to come of this. But the second thing that you have to understand is that Emmett Till did not understand the playing rules, right? And so they didn't understand when they dared him to do this. They didn't understand that he didn't get it, never resonated with him why that was such a huge, huge deal and why he would literally be taking his life into somebody else's hands in the process of doing this. What happens next is the subject of controversy. And if you want to believe her account, uh, uh, that of Mary Bryant, the woman in question here. Um, he stormed into the store and slapped his hand on her and said, hey, baby, how about a date? Now, I'm not saying that she's lying, but I am saying that I was once upon a time 14, and the idea of doing something like that to an older lady, nonetheless, would have really made me nervous. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is I find that account to be just slightly less than believable. What I find a lot more believable is the FBI report that would come out several months later that said something to the effect that Emmett went through the motions and he just kind of uttered some smart alecky comment on his way out, something to the effect of "Bye, baby," something along those lines. Now, he didn't think too much of it, and you and I probably wouldn't think too much of it. But in Mississippi in the 1950s, that was akin to rape, right? That was the ultimate sexual taboo. It was unrestrained African American male sexual aggression against white female purity, right? And there had been other African American men that had been lynched for far less than that. And the people that are watching this, his cousins and their friends on the outside, they cannot believe what they've just witnessed. And so what they do is they swoop Emmett up, who's completely oblivious to what just happened. They swoop him up and they get him out of there, and they're hoping to buy enough time to send him back up to Chicago before anything bad happens. Well, it wasn't very long before something bad, in fact, happened. The husband of Mary Bryant was a guy by the name of Roy Bryant, who happened to be away on business. He was a truck driver. When he got back that night, she explained to him what happened, or the first side of the story. He flips out. He goes and gets his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of J.W. Millam, and they go looking for Emmett Till. Now, Money, Mississippi, this scene of the crime, is a very, very small town. And everybody knows everybody else's business. So it doesn't take these guys long to find Emmett Till. He's staying at his grandfather's house, Mose Wright. They bang on the door and they insist on being let in, and Mose lets them in. And although he tried to put up a little bit of resistance when it comes to not handing Emmett over, what Roy Bryant reminded him of is the way that the rural South worked at the time. He asked him how old he was, and when Mose Wright says he was 65, Bryant told him if he wanted to see 66, he would keep his mouth shut and hand the kid over to him, which is exactly what happens next. Now, again, what happens next is the subject of controversy. And if you want to believe the story of Bryant and Milam, they took Emmett to the outskirts of town and beat the daylights out of him at this barn because what they wanted to do was get him to cry, humiliate himself. And according to Milam, he just never did that. Milam had served in the Army in World War II. And according to Milam, he said, I have some rights. Later on, he would admit to the slaying of Emmett Till. I have some rights. I fought for this country, and I'm tired of you Northerners coming down here and spreading your poison, and I'm going to teach you a lesson. And at that point, he shot Emmett Till in the head. They wrapped a 75-pound cotton fan around his body and dumped his remains in the Tallahatchie River. They thought that that was the end of it. A couple days later, fishermen had spotted a foot sticking out from the surface of the water. The sheriff is called, they fish the remains out, and it's determined pretty quickly to be the remains of Emmett Till. Mamie Till, back in Chicago, was stricken with grief, as I'm sure you can imagine. But she insisted that her remains, the remains of her son, be sent home to Chicago. Originally, the sheriff's department wanted Emmett Till buried in Mississippi. They want this thing to go away as quickly as possible for very obvious reasons. They don't want the spotlight of racism on their neck of the woods in the United States. Mamie Till teamed up with the Chicago and Mississippi NAACP, and they raised the funds to ship Emmett back up to Chicago. But the coroner's office in Mississippi had strict instructions not to open the pine box, the coffin of which housed the remains of Emmett Till. Mamie rejected these instructions, and she insisted on an open casket funeral. What she wanted was the world to see the raw, unapologetic barbarity of American racism. What took place on State Street in Chicago was more or less a civil rights rally. The entire world got a good, close, personal, warts and all view of American racism. The tattered remains, the twisted, mangled remains of Emmett Till was front page news on every newspaper in America. The Soviet Union, for that matter, had a field day with this. I said, this is American democracy at its finest. It was propaganda for the communists. I'll circle back to that in just a minute. But for right now, what the blood of Emmett Till is going to do is it's going to bring attention to the crisis that is American racism and race relations. Now, because the news was so big, Mississippi couldn't get away with sweeping this under the rug. They'd at least have to go through the motions when it comes to putting Bryant and Milam on trial. The jury that served for the murder case of Bryant and Milam, exclusively white, and the defense attorneys that are going to work for the defendants, they're working pro bono. In other words, they're working for free. They've got bigger fish to fry, if you understand what I'm saying, than making money on this case. The defense is going to rest its case on two primary issues, one of which the prosecution had failed to prove that the remains were those of Emmett Till. Could be anything, could be roadkill for all we know. And secondly, that your grandfathers would roll over in their graves if they knew that you voted to convict these two good Southern boys. In other words, there's racial solidarity that is at stake here. Okay, it took the all-white jury less than 1 hour to bring in a not guilty verdict. And so, in addition to the violence, there's this utter lack of justice that accompanies the situation of Emmett Till. And what the case of Emmett Till demonstrated, I think, was two things. Number one, not even children, keep in mind, he was 14 years old, not even children were immune to this level of just barbaric racial violence. And number two, there would have to be changes. we can't present ourselves of the democratic light of the world, that only in America do these things not happen, and we allow this level of injustice to go forward. There was something about Emmett Till, the innocence of Emmett Till, that just did not go away, and people did not forget it. But it does demonstrate this system of segregation. And Emmett Till had broken an unspoken rule of the South. He had made an advance, didn't matter how innocent it was, he had made an advance on a white woman, and that's something that you never would have done if you happen to be a person of color during this time period. Now, we know that Plessy versus Ferguson essentially legalized the system of Jim Crow and white supremacy broadly defined. But the problem with this is not only is it going on unchallenged, but if you happen to be the mother and father of a son like Emmett Till, if you want that son to survive, you need to teach him how to get along in this sort of situation. And so this is how and why the system of segregation is going on unchallenged. The system's held up by a combination of violence and poverty. If things are going to change, you're going to need a very significant overhaul here. Now, the good news is that there had been changes in the works. Fighting in not only World War II, but World War I also gave the African American community a new perspective in terms of racial assertiveness. If you think back for a second, this whole idea of the new Negro, certainly that did not end in the aftermath of World War I. And this sentiment of being more racially assertive is going to survive into the World War II years. There's something else I want you to keep in mind. When Harry Truman proclaimed that the United States was the light of the world, and we planned to export democracy into every cold corner of it, a lot of people bought into this whole idea. Right? A lot of people believed that if we were going to proclaim ourselves to be the hope of the world, then we better start living up to that letter of the law right here at home. There's this idea that we need to fight totalitarianism both abroad, but also right here at home as well. One way that we're beginning to do this would be the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. Now, once again, we've talked about this to some extent in this class, but I didn't really get a chance to tell you about what went into the Supreme Court's decision. In 1938, there was a pair of psychologists in Brooklyn, New York. They were the Clarks, and they conducted what came to be known as the Clark-Doll experiment. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson said that as long as those train car accommodations were equal, you could segregate however you wanted to. The problem with Plessy at the time is we did not have this academic discipline known as psychology. What the Clark-Doll experiment consisted of was several African American girls that were given a choice as to which doll that they would like, which doll that they would prefer, a black doll and a white doll. And without exception, each and every one of these black girls chose the white doll. Because through the system of white supremacy and the Jim Crow system of the United States at the time, they had been socially conditioned to believe that white was superior to black. And so when Thurgood Marshall, the lead attorney for the NAACP, is presenting his case in Brown versus Board of Education, he uses the Clark-Doll experiment. And this goes a long, long way when it comes to the idea that racism instilled this feeling of inferiority to people who are being discriminated against. And in the end, the Supreme Court agreed. The Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the man that wrote the majority decision on the decision, proclaimed that those lessons that we learn early on in life are very likely to stay with us for the rest of our lives. And if you tell a group of students, children, that they're not good enough to go to this school, it's unlikely that they'll ever be able to, unlearn those lessons, right? And so this is progress. We're moving forward. At least on paper, we've taken down the legal justification of Jim Crow. That's not to say that the schools integrated it instantaneously. We know this because we've talked about Little Rock, Arkansas, and the Little Rock Nine, right? We're also seeing more direct action, and to that end, there's a guy that I'd like you to be familiar with. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, that's Medgar Evers. He's one of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. Evers is a World War II veteran, and in the aftermath of the war, he's going to come back home, and he's going to be instrumental in the founding of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. one of the things that he's going to do is he's going to test the limitations of the Brown decision by applying for admissions to the University of Mississippi. Mississippi shut him down very quickly, and they were pretty blunt. Your kind are not welcome at our institution, and he's not going to integrate the University of Mississippi. All that being said, he is going to tutor the first African American student to enter into that university, a guy by the name of James Meredith. And so he is going to provide this direct action that will be forcing the issue of the Brown decision and making the federal government justify why they are not enforcing the letter of the Brown law. There's another direct action endeavor that I'd like you to associate with Evers, and that would be his wade-ins. Keep in mind, much of Mississippi is beachfront, and the beaches, just like they were in Chicago, were highly segregated. You couldn't just go to whatever beach that you chose. And what these wade-ins would do is they're very similar to the sit-ins, where you would just sit in a part of a beach and refuse to move until the law enforcement acknowledged that you had a right to be there. This direct action is going to win him a lot of fame and notoriety, even amongst people that don't necessarily share his enthusiasm for civil rights. James Meredith is going to be a victim of the White Citizens Council. He's going to be assassinated in his driveway when he comes back from an NAACP meeting in the mid-1950s. But his direct action is going to instill a level of confidence and passion that was going to be picked up and emulated by others. One of those others that I want you to be familiar with would be a lady from Alabama by the name of Rosa Parks. Much like Evers, Parks is a card-carrying member of the NAACP, and what the NAACP had been looking for in the mid-1950s is some sort of test case that they could use to drive home the issue of integrating American life. Right? In 1950,